Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into the very core of our central nervous system. We're talking about the gross anatomy of the spinal cord and all its nerves. Our guide for this is Chapter 47 of Gray's Anatomy. And our mission, really, is to build a solid three-dimensional map in your head of everything happening inside that vertebral canal.
And this isn't just, an academic tour. For anyone in a clinical setting, surgery, pain management, trauma understanding these spatial relationships it's everything. Knowing exactly where the cord ends, how the nerve roots are running, the blood supply, that's what allows for efficient management and, frankly, what prevents really serious
So
complications.
let's get oriented. The spinal cord itself, this main highway, starts right below the foramen magnum. It's continuous with the medulla oblongata,
Mm.
and it sits inside the top two-thirds of the vertebral canal, basically a protected cylinder of neural tissue.
And maybe the most critical landmark for any clinician is its termination. The cord does not run the full length of your spine. It ends in a tapered cone-shaped segment called the conus medullaris.
Right, and here's the famous anatomical curveball. During development, the bony vertebral column grows way faster than the cord itself.
Exactly. And that difference in growth rate creates what we call the segment vertebra mismatch. So in an adult, the coneus, the end of the cord, typically terminates somewhere around the middle of the L1 vertebral body.
Typically being the key word there.
Oh, absolutely. The range is actually pretty wide. It could be as high as T11 or, go as low as L3.
So you're saying you have to rely on imaging. You can't just go by external landmarks for a procedure like a lumbar puncture.
You use both, but that L1 rule is your baseline for safety. You just don't go in above that level in an adult without some very clear imaging. And if you look at the cord's shape, it's actually wider side to side transversely than it is front to back.
And that widening, does that have to do with all the sensory information coming in from the limbs?
It absolutely does. The cord has to swell in two major places to handle the sheer volume of fibers for the arms and legs. The gray matter just expands. First, you have the cervical enlargement. This runs from about the C3 to T2 segments.
And that's for the brachial plexus, supplying the upper limbs.
Right. It hits its biggest circumference around C6.
Then way down, you get the lumbar enlargement. It's serving the lower limbs, but because of that mismatch, the segments themselves are actually located way up at the T9 to T12 vertebral levels.
And you can't have the structure just floating around. It needs an anchor. So coming off the very tip of the conus medullaris, you get this long, thin strand. It's about 20 centimeters. That's the phylum terminale.
And this is divided into two parts,
Or
right?
we split it into two. The first part, the phylum terminale internum, is the upper 15 centimeters. It stays inside the dural sheath and goes down to about S2,
So it's a useful landmark on an MRI.
a very useful landmark. Then the last 5 centimeters, the phylum terminale externum actually fuses with the dura and anchors the whole system down to the first piece of the coccyx. It's the final tether.
Okay, so let's look at the surface of the cord itself. It's split pretty neatly into two halves. You've got this deep groove down the front.
The ventral median fissure.
Right, and it's full of pia mater and blood vessels. Then on the back, there's a shallower groove, the posterior median sulcus.
And if you were to slice the cord in cross-section, you'd see that classic H shape of gray matter inside, surrounded by all the white matter. And that white matter is organized into columns, or funiculi, which are divided by the nerve rootlets coming out.
So let's picture those. The back portion is the dorsal funiculus. This is where all that sensory information for fine touch and position travels, correct?
That's the one. And because there's so much data coming from the limbs in the neck and upper back, that dorsal funiculus actually has to split into 2 tracks. The medial part is the fasciculus gracilis, that's for the lower body, and the lateral part is the fasciculus cuneatus for the upper body.
And the rest of the white matter, wrapping the sides and front, that's the ventrolateral funiculus. It's carrying a mix of motor and sensory pathways. Now let's wrap this whole thing in its protective layers, the meninges, starting with the outermost tough sheath, the theca.
The theca, which is the dura and arachnoid together, runs all the way down to S2. But outside of the dura is a really important area, the epidural space.
And this isn't an empty space?
No, not at all. It's packed with fat, connective tissue, arteries, and crucially, a really big network of low-pressure veins.
The fat is mostly for cushioning, right?
Yeah.
To let the dura slide during movement.
Exactly, mechanical cushioning.
Right.
But clinically, that venous plexus is a huge deal. It doesn't have any valves, so it's a direct route for things like infections or cancer cells to spread up and down the spine and even up into the cranium.
Yikes. Okay, then just deep to that, we find the subarachnoid space, which is full of cerebrospinal fluid.
And because it's so large and accessible below where the cord ends at L1, well, that's your target for lumbar puncture.
But the cord still needs to be stabilized side to side within that fluid-filled sac.
It does, and for that we have the ligamentum denticulatum. It's this beautiful fibrous sheet of pia mater on each side of the cord. It sends out these little triangular teeth, about 20 or so, that pierce the arachnoid and anchor themselves right to the inner surface of the dura.
So it's like a suspension system,
Well,
holding the cord right in the middle, preventing it from sloshing around.
perfectly put. It sits right between the ventral and dorsal nerve roots as they exit.
Okay, let's talk about those nerve roots. The spinal nerve itself is a mixed nerve, formed from two different roots joining together.
You've got the dorsal roots, which carry sensory or afferent information into the cord.
And you can always spot those because they have that little swelling, the spinal ganglion, where the sensory neuron cell bodies live.
Correct. And then you have the ventral roots, which carry efferent motor commands out from the cord. Those two merge to form the mixed spinal nerve.
And because the cord is so much shorter than the spine, those lower nerve roots have to travel a long way down to exit.
A very long way. They descend as this big sheaf of nerves within the theca, looking like a horse's tail.
The cauda.
The cauda. And that's another reason the LP is safe down there. You're just pushing aside these mobile nerve roots, not poking the solid spinal cord.
Let's run through the number. 31 pairs in total, 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. And the exit rules are different for the neck.
They are. It's a key point. The C1 through C7 nerves exit above their matching vertebra. C8 is the transition nerve. It comes out between C7 and T1.
And from that point on, it's simple. All the thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerves exit below their corresponding vertebra.
Which is fundamental for diagnosis. An L4, L5 disc problem is usually going to hit the L5 nerve root as it's heading for the exit below the L5 pedicle.
And once that spinal nerve is formed, right there in the foramen, it immediately slits.
Immediately. It divides into two primary rami, or branches. The smaller dorsal rami stay segmental. They go straight back to supply the deep extensor muscles and the skin of the back. They don't form big networks.
But the ventral rami are the big ones, the workhorses.
They are. They're much larger. They supply the front and sides of the trunk and all the limbs. And these are the ones that weave together to form the major nerve plexuses.
The cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses that control all our complex movements.
And don't forget the little recurrent nerves.
Oh, the meningeal nerves.
The sinuvertebral nerves, right? They branch off and loop right back into the canal to provide pain sensation to the dura, the ligaments, the bone. That's your deep spinal pain source.
Okay, let's shift to the blood supply, which, as the source notes, is a bit precarious. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The arterial system is set up longitudinally. There is a single anterior spinal artery that runs right down the front in that ventral median fissure.
A single artery. And it supplies the central 2/3 of the cord's cross-section.
It does.
So that includes the anterior horns, where all the motor neurons live. If that one artery fails, you're looking at devastating motor loss.
Devastating. On the back, you have a pair of posterior spinal arteries running along the posterolateral sulci. But these long arteries can't do it alone. They need reinforcement from segmental arteries that come in from the sides with the nerve roots.
And among those feeders, one of them is the MVP.
Without a doubt, the great anterior radiculomedullary artery of Adamkiewicz. It's the biggest feeder of them all. It usually comes in on the left side, somewhere between T9 and L2.
And its clinical importance can't be overstated.
No, it can't. This one artery might be the main or even the only significant blood supply for the entire lower 2/3 of the spinal cord.
So if that gets damaged during, say, an aortic surgery,
You get a catastrophe. Ischemia of the anterior 2/3 of the cord, we call it anterior cord syndrome, complete loss of motor function below that level.
and there's also a known weak spot, isn't there?
Yes, the critical vascular zone between T4 and T9. This area is a watershed region, far from the major feeders above and below. It makes it incredibly susceptible to ischemia during periods of low blood pressure. It's often the site of injury that results in paraplegia after systemic hypotension.
So how does the drainage system, the venous side, compare?
It's a low-pressure system that basically mirrors the arteries. Veins inside the cord drain to a surface network called the coronal plexus, and from now, blood collects into longitudinal veins and then drains out segmentally into those big, valveless vertebral venous plexuses.
Okay, so with that anatomy in mind, let's talk about the clinical side. The language for spinal trauma is very specific.
It has to be. We use tetraplegia for an injury in the cervical cord, affecting all four limbs, and paraplegia for an injury in the thoracic, lumbar, or sacral cord, affecting the trunk and lower limbs.
And it's worth saying again, the level of the bone fracture does not necessarily match the level of the cord segment damage.
Never assume they match. A T10 fracture can easily damage the L1 to L3 cord segment sitting inside.
Now, when a patient comes in with back pain, the sources give us a great way to differentiate the two main types. First up is radicular pain.
Radicular pain means the nerve root or its ganglion is being irritated, maybe by a disc herniation. The pain is classic. It radiates in a narrow, sharp band. It follows a single dermatome. Patients will say it's like a lancinating electric shock down their leg.
It follows the wire, basically.
Exactly.
And the other type is somatic referred pain, which is much fuzzier.
Correct. This comes from musculoskeletal structures, a facet joint, a ligament, a muscle. The pain is felt as a deep, broad ache, and patients can't really point to exactly where it is. It's diffuse because those tissues have overlapping sensory fields from multiple nerves. The quality of the pain tells you the source.
And right at the end of the cord, we have two distinct syndromes we need to contrast.
Cauda equina syndrome versus conus medullaris syndrome. With cauda equina, you're compressing the nerve roots after the cord has ended. So the symptoms are often asymmetric saddle numbness, asymmetric leg weakness. Bladder problems tend to show up later.
But with conus medullaris syndrome, you're damaging the tip of the cord itself.
The cord itself. So the deficits are usually symmetric saddle anesthesia, symmetric weakness. And because you're hitting the control centers directly, you get early bladder and sphincter dysfunction.
Finally, let's just walk through the path of a lumbar puncture again. To be
Yes.
safe, you have to go in below L1 or L2 in an adult into that big subarachnoid space where there's no solid cord.
And you can feel the layers as you go. You pass through skin, subcutaneous tissue, the supraspinous ligament, then the really tough interspinous ligament. Then you feel a distinct pop as you go through the very dense ligamentum flavum.
And that pop puts you into the epidural space.
Right, into the fat-filled epidural space.
Yeah.
And your final push is through the dura and arachnoid membranes, and then CSF should flow.
So what does this all mean? This deep dive really confirms that the spinal column's anatomy is just. It's a masterpiece of protection and stabilization, but also one with some serious engineering constraints. We've mapped the cord's high termination at L1, we understand the mismatch that gives us that safety zone for an LP, and we've distinguished that sharp electric radicular pain from the deep, achy somatic pain.
And for me, the core takeaway is always about patient safety and that vascular map. The fact that this huge, vital central cord area relies on a single anterior spinal artery, which itself is only fed inconsistently by feeders like the artery of Adamkiewicz. It just leaves zones like T4 to T9 incredibly vulnerable.
Which makes me wonder, considering that vulnerability, especially in the T4, T9 critical zone, and how variable the blood supply can be from person to person, what does that mean for future non-surgical treatments? Things like stem cell therapies. How do you ensure your therapy gets to where it needs to go in such a precarious vascular system? It's definitely something to think about.
We hope this deep dive into the gross anatomy of the spinal column provides you with a robust, visual, and clinically oriented shortcut for your learning.
Thanks for engaging in this detailed anatomical study with us on the Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.